Washington Post has an amazing story about an amazing meeting in Seychelles Island that happened between Eric Prince, who is the founder of the company that used to be called Blackwater. They got in a lot of legal trouble here in the US and had to actually move to the Gulf. And Russian representatives and Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. Now, UAE was involved in this meeting as well. So this happened in a very clandestine way, and apparently Eric Prince representing Donald Trump's interests. So the details are very, very important, and what the Washington Post did not mention, I will tell you at the end as to why this story is even bigger than people realize. In fact, this could be everything. So I'll explain. First, let's go to the Post. The United Arab Emirates arranged a secret meeting in January between Blackwater founder Eric Prince and a Russian close to President Vladimir Putin as part of an apparent effort to establish a back-channel line of communication between Moscow, President-elect Donald Trump, according to US, European, and Arab officials. So they have very good sourcing on this. There was, by the way, two different princes at the meeting, Eric Prince and the Abu Dhabi Prince. Prince was an avid supporter of Trump, Eric Prince that is. After the Republican convention, he contributed $250,000 to Trump's campaign, the National Party, and a pro-Trump super PAC led by GOP mega donor Rebekah Mercer, records show. He has ties to people in Trump's circle, including Stephen Bannon, now serving as president's chief strategist and senior counselor. Get a load of this. Prince's sister, Betsy DeVos, serves as education secretary in the Trump administration, and Prince was seen in the Trump transition offices in New York in December. This meeting winds up happening in January. So everybody's gonna get something out of this meeting. We already know what the Eric Prince's family got out of it. They got a cabinet post. Betsy DeVos is now education secretary. Now that's not the only thing that they might have gotten out of it. Eric Prince has a lot of financial interests in our military spending. He used to benefit greatly from our military spending and the largesse and of our Pentagon budget, and he looks forward to doing so again. He's also got hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts for setting up paramilitary units inside the UAE. So UAE, which is basically a dictatorship, Eric Prince helps those dictators remain in power by crushing any kind of opposition. What a swell guy. Okay, and then he goes on to complain about terrorists and how they're fascist. You're the one setting up paramilitary units and helping dictators. Okay, now the Russian part of this is, of course, very interesting and probably the most relevant part for us. We'll get to that. So the Washington Post continues to explain. Current and former US officials said that while Prince refrained from playing a direct role in the Trump transition, his name surfaced so frequently in internal discussions that he seemed to function as an outside advisor whose opinions were valued on a range of issues, including plans for overhauling the US intelligence community. God help us all. He appears to have particularly close ties to Bannon, appearing multiple times on the Breitbart satellite radio program and website that Bannon ran before joining the Trump campaign. So now, if the Trump guys needed someone to run a paramilitary outfit inside the United States, well, now they have their guy. Okay, so we'll have to worry about that beast later, because more to the point of this story is what in the world happened in that meeting in Seychelles. And you don't go to Seychelles in the middle of nowhere if you're not looking to have a very, very secret meeting about probably the most sensitive materials you could have. You can have the meeting almost anywhere if it's not about something you desperately want to keep secret. Okay, the Seychelles meeting came after separate private discussions in New York involving high-ranking representatives of Trump with both Moscow and the Emirates. The White House has acknowledged that Michael T. Flynn, Trump's original national security advisor, and Trump advisor and son-in-law Jared Kushner met with the Russian ambassador to the United States, Sergei Kislyak, in late November or early December in New York. Okay, so they have these high-level meetings with the Russians, and then all of a sudden, meeting materializes in Seychelles across the globe. Now, that is not on the records, that we don't know about. that we just found out about because of the Washington Post report? Well, as they explain, the level of discretion surrounding the Seychelles meeting seems extraordinary given the frequency with which senior Trump advisors, including Flynn and Kushner, had interacted with Russian officials in the United States, including at the high-profile Trump Tower in New York. So if they were not overly careful about those meetings, why go to these lengths to go to Seychelles? What were they discussing? Now, the Washington Post talks about how the UAE has an interest in fighting against Iran. Now, the Russians are largely helping Iran in Syria. And so there's some speculation that the meeting is about, hey, can we flip the Russians to help fight against Iran? What do the Russians get out of that? That is never explained. Now, my guess is that it is not about any Iranian deal, and if it was, well, the UAE must be significantly disappointed, and perhaps that's why we find out about this in the first place, because the Russians have continued to help Iran, and now Donald Trump is helping the Russians in Syria accomplish their objectives, which helps the Iranian-backed government of Bashar al-Assad. So if the UAE thought the deal was about Iran, they appear to be mistaken. So what was it really about? Well, now I'm going to go to a different story that I shared with you that I told you was super important when I gave it to you. It was about a server for the Trump organization, a computer server, in the middle of Pennsylvania, in a small town. And some of the top experts in cybersecurity in the world noticed that that server was getting messages mysteriously, almost exclusively, but not exclusively, from one source. That was from a Russian bank called Alpha Bank. Now, they can't tell because they're just looking at things that are public in cyberspace. Now, you and I can't see it, but they're cybersecurity experts, trusted on all sides. Very long story that CNN actually did a wonderful job with in that case about that. And they noticed, they don't know what's in the messages, but they noticed that Alpha Bank in Russia is communicating with with the Trump server in Pennsylvania. Obviously set up in the middle of Pennsylvania so that it doesn't attract attention. It's not in Trump Tower, it's not anywhere else. But what I told you at the end of that story is, yes, that's very, very interesting and it might be indicative of something going on. But I said the key is in the second biggest communications that Trump server had. So 80% of the communications came from Alpha Bank. The Trump people's explanation for it was comical. Maybe it was accidental spam that happened to be going to that server. 80% of all of the communication was from a Russian bank accidentally? Come on. No rational human being can believe that. But again, I said it depends. Well, what's the second biggest chunk? Well, 18% of the communication was from another organization, from one organization. It was from Spectrum. I thought that was curious. Now, if Spectrum turns out to be a random entity, well, then we got nothing. Maybe it was spam. But it turns out Spectrum is not random. From that story from CNN, Spectrum is a medical facility chain led by Dick DeVos, the husband of Betsy DeVos, who was appointed by Trump as US Education Secretary. And they explained together, Alpha Bank and Spectrum accounted for 99% of the lookups to that Trump server in Pennsylvania. So let me get this right. Eric Prince does a secret meeting with the Russians in Seychelles Islands. And at the same time, we've got Russian banks and the other part of the DeVos family that Eric Prince is part of, pinging this Trump server in the middle of Pennsylvania. And you think those things are not connected. I got news for you. They are significantly connected. Now, the question that could change history, and I'm not using hyperbole here, I mean it literally, is can they prove it? Now, based on this evidence, my very significant guess is that Trump did a financial deal with the Russians. If you want someone dirty who doesn't mind getting into those weeds and doing that deal for you in secret, who would you pick if you were an extreme right winger? You'd pick the guy who started Blackwater. And what does he want? Well, he wants a lot of government contracts and he wants his sister to be the education secretary. What do the Russians want? The Russians want the sanctions lifted that cost them $500 billion deal with ExxonMobil. So they want the sanctions lifted. They want the American president to badmouth NATO. They want the American president to let them do whatever they want in Syria, and to not complain if they have aggressive military and foreign policy. Well, the sanctions haven't been lifted yet, but they've gotten everything else that they've wanted. And are the sanctions going to be lifted? I mean, the deal that they care most about, the $500 billion deal, was with ExxonMobil. Well, who would lift the sanctions? Oh, right, our Secretary of State would. Who's our Secretary of State? Oh, right, the former CEO of ExxonMobil. There's a deal, guys. It is the most obvious thing in the world. You don't put Rex Tillerson out of nowhere to be the Secretary of State unless you make this deal. So the Russians will get the sanctions lifted. That is what they get out of the deal. The DeVos and the princes got what they need. What does Trump get? Whoa, that's a really interesting question. If you think just the presidency, you don't know Trump at all. What he cares about is the money. So him being elected president, it's nice. But what is it going to lead to? Is it going to lead to more cash? That's what he cares about. So this part I do not know. And right now, with the evidence we have in public, it is very hard to know. Was it to take care of some loans that he had with the Russians? We know that he did get loans from the Russians. Now, we don't know the degree of those loans because he won't release his tax returns. And he funneled them through Deutsche Bank, and he had it in the same part of the bank that was called the Global Laundromat. And guess who else had money in that same part of Deutsche Bank? Russian oligarchs. What another amazing coincidence. Was it to help them launder the money? Was it to get rid of old debts? Was it to get a part of Rosneft? That's the largest oil company in Russia that just sold 19% of itself to mysterious owners, some of which they have revealed and some of which they haven't. There's 25% of that sale that the Russian government says, we're not gonna tell you who bought it and deal with it. Does that include Donald Trump? That's the stuff we don't know yet. But if they're gonna get him on this, and I think all of this, if you're a reasonable human being, leads to the conclusion that none of it is a coincidence. It is almost certainly tied, and I think it is very fair assumption to say that it was actually a financial deal, not just to get him to be president, which, by the way, of course, would be treason. Now, there's a long way from here to there, and you've got to prove it. And if you don't prove it, Steve Bannon, Eric Prince, and Donald Trump stay in power, and God knows what they do. What kind of organization do they set up here in America? What do they do to their political enemies? And if you're gonna build a case against the president of the United States of America, you're gonna need a couple of smoking guns. One alone probably won't do it. So let's hope they were sloppy. Let's hope that Donald Trump is as stupid as I think he is, and that you could trace the financial transactions. If you can, they're in a world of trouble. If you can't, the rest of us are in a world of trouble. That's how important this story is. Membership helps fund the Young Turks. You know one great thing about that? That means we're not accountable to anyone but you guys. That's why we're strong together, because we built this show around you. Come build it even bigger and better at tytnetwork.com/join.